I was driving home from work and traffic was backed up pretty badly for a few miles. It was stop and go. When I get stuck in that, I'll usually back about 75 feet off the car in front of me so that I can hold a pace and move at a slow but constant roll, like the semi-trucks do. This way I'm not participating in the bumper-to-bumper move and brake like the rest of the smooth brain drivers. Some dude in an Acura crossover was behind me, and I guess he was getting upset because I wasn't 2 feet from the car in front of me, driving like a smooth brain. So he gets up on my butt and starts beeping his horn at me. Lol, I think to myself as I turn up my radio. But then he starts flashing his brights at me, which is where I get annoyed. He's in one of those Acuras that has the super bright LED headlights. My car is much lower than his, so his low beams are already pretty bright in my mirrors. Bright enough that I don't want to look in them. The first time he flashed his high beams, it put spots in my vision for a moment. It genuinely hurt my eyes. After the first flash, he waits for about 10 seconds, beeps his horn, and then flashes me again. Now I'm getting pissed. I'm thinking, where the fuck do you want me to go? Do you really think being 2 feet from the car in front of you will make traffic move faster? Then he flashes me a third time, but this time he held them on for about 15 seconds. Time for the gloves to come off. During those 15 seconds, as in looking away from my mirrors, I see my 14,000 lumen searchlight sitting in my passenger seat, at which point I'm immediately overcome by a wave of chaotic lawful excitement. What he has just set in motion cannot be stopped. I think to myself, oh buddy, you just opened the wrong can of worms. You're gonna learn today. I grabbed the flashlight and set it to its absolute max 14,000 lumen brightness setting. The flashlight has a sensor in it to automatically dim the light if facing down on a table, because otherwise the diodes would get so hot they would melt the lens. The 14,000 lumen setting is so intense, the 57 watt-hour battery can only hold it for 180 seconds before the flashlight automatically notches down to a measly 9,500 lumens. During those 180 seconds, the light will burn through 15% of its battery power. For reference on just how bright this is, the literal fucking sun emits a luminosity of 11,000 lumens per square foot on a bright and clear day. I turn around and aim it straight out the back of my rear window. My car is pretty noisy, so before I turn it on, I rev up my engine to make sure Captain Smoothbrain is eyes forward when I violate his retinas with the full force of an afternoon sun. I hit the power button and can only imagine the freight train of shock and pain that plowed over this man. It was so bright, his automatic headlights shut off because the car thought it was daytime. With the light on, I could see him clear as glass through his tinted windshield. He was covering his eyes and looking down, probably screaming. I watched him try and flip down his sun visor, but his hand couldn't find it. As I thought to myself, burn you motherfucker, burn. I imagine my facial expression was similar to that of a 6-year-old roasting insects with a magnifying glass on a bright summer day. After about 5 seconds of blinding light, I took mercy and shut it off. He proceeded to back way the hell off and move over to a different lane. Was this an unsafe thing for me to do? Absolutely. Was this illegal? Almost certainly. Was it warranted? Without question. Possibly the highlight of my year. Drive safe and don't be a dick to the car in front of you, because they might just have the tools to teach you a lesson. TLDR. Dickhead in traffic was excessively flashing his high beams at me, hurting my eyes, because I couldn't go faster than the car in front of me. So I showed him how it feels. My ex stole from me close to 90 euros, which I saved up for 9 years, and when I took her to court, I lost due to lack of evidence. At the moment, I felt destroyed and lost it all. She even sued me for emotional damages, and I had to pay 55 euros. So I was forced to sell my house and take a big loan from the bank. I stayed at a friend and helped me find some good lawyers. And we just found an amazing one. In one day, he helped me so much and even helped me get the info of who took money from my bank account. Something was wrong. 29th of June, a transaction happened in my name. I never made it. I was not in the country at the time. Well, would you look at that? I was ready to get back into court when I found out that she bought my house. Well, I have a safe that I never told her about hidden in the bathroom behind the cabinet. Well, she ruined my life. Why not ruin her even more? So I had an accomplice that helped me buy some drugs, worth about 400 euros, and used a friend to hide it there. The safe has a 4-digit code, that being 0. Never got to change it to something else. And before taking her to court again, I had that same friend who hid the drugs turn her in. It took about a week for the cops to receive a mandate to search the house. They found nothing in the first 2 hours, and they wouldn't if my friend forgot to leave the safe cover open. That 400 euro worth of drugs are equal to a 5 euro fine and 12 years of prison. Well, I'm not done yet. Court time again. I had my lawyer get the footage from when the money from the bank was transferred, and also I had a document showing that I was not in the country at the time. We also found out the account to which the money was sent to. The name was that of my ex. Well, look how the tables have just turned. My lawyer also demanded payment for emotional damage, all the money that was stolen, the house, and also money equivalent to 2 times the debt I had in the bank, which is equal to about 140 euros. The look on her face when everything came down crashing on her was totally worth it. And on top of the 12 years from drug possession, she received an additional 25 years for theft and false testimony. Enjoy it, bitch. My dad was nearly beaten to death, and my grandfather went nuclear on everyone involved. This isn't my story, but it comes from my dad and other family members who witnessed it. Background. This all went down in the late 1970s when my dad was 17. The area he grew up in was in the UK and was a stereotypical working-class town. The part of town my family lived in was run down, full of poor families, and had its fair share of crime. But it was close-knit, and everyone knew everyone. This will be important later. Now my dad wasn't the most well-behaved kid, and he had hated being at school, but aside from a speeding ticket, he had never been in trouble with the police. He was, and still is, a really talented musician, and had a very active social life. For his 17th birthday, one of his friends had bought him a leather jacket with a very specific logo on it. We'll call this friend Dave for future reference. According to my dad, it was a rare and quite expensive motorcycle jacket. He was extremely happy that Dave had got it for him. Dave had bought himself the same jacket a while before, and it was a big surprise. My grandmother apparently joked that with the jackets on they looked like twins, and she wasn't far wrong. They had similar features, black hair, and were both well known for being kitted out in motorcycle gear. A few days after my dad's birthday, he was leaving work as a bartender in the town center at around 10 p.m. As he was getting close to where his bike was parked, a gang of 5 men approached him from behind. The last thing my dad remembers was being smacked over the head and passing out as he hit the floor. These men beat up my dad with bike chains and a crowbar, literally to within an inch of his life. Luckily, 2 bouncers from a nearby pub had heard the commotion and rushed to help. The men ran off. The bouncers called the cops, and my dad was taken to hospital. It turned out that Dave had quite a substantial gambling habit and owed a large amount of money to people who you really didn't want to owe money to. They had threatened Dave and told him that they would be looking for him to teach him a lesson. So Dave decided to set up my dad to take the beating instead of himself, or at least lessen his chances of taking it. He had bought my dad the same jacket because these guys knew that was what he wore when he rode. He then arranged for a guy he knew to find out when my dad left work and call up the loan sharks to let them know where Dave was. What a scumbag. The revenge. My grandfather and grandmother were obviously distraught about this whole thing. The first thought on my grandfather's mind was if my dad would survive. When that was answered, his second was how best to get revenge. Bit of background on my grandfather. He was a lifelong boxer and a career military man. He enlisted at the back end of WW2 at 17. stayed in the forces through Korea, and then served in Malaya and Burma as a scout and sniper during the mid to late 1950s. He only reluctantly retired when my dad was little and worked as an engineer after his discharge. This guy was a certified badass, even into his 50s, and although he wasn't the best husband or father at times, he could never stand by and watch his family get hurt. The first move my grandfather made was to call up every ex-service buddy, bouncer, pub landlord, etc. that he knew, and even a few less than legit characters he knew from the pubs. In my town, word traveled fast, and my grandfather was well-liked and had a bit of a reputation, so it wasn't long before he had the names and addresses of the 5 men who had attacked my dad. Apparently, these guys had been bragging about beating up a defenseless man from behind. These guys were career criminals with violent reputations, but my grandfather really didn't give a shit who or what they were. My grandfather then called up a few of the most dangerous, hardened guys he knew from the service. He explained to them what had happened, and they were all happy to help. One night, the group kicked in the doors of each thug and beat them to a pulp. All 5 of them. They knew that if they hit one, the others would hear about it and run, so they hit all 5 of them in one night. My grandfather knew that no one would call the police in the area they lived in. Talking to the cops was a big no-no in that area back then, so there was little chance of being caught. All 5 guys ended up bloodied with broken bones, shattered teeth, and the requirement to be fed from a tube by the end of the night. One of them had to be put into a medically induced coma. Of course, the police interviewed all of them in hospital when they sufficiently recovered, but none of them talked, both out of fear of my grandfather and fear they would be labeled as rats, and nothing came of it. But my grandfather wasn't done there. My grandfather used his connections in the clubs and bars to start spreading rumors about why they had been beaten up. Soon it had gotten round that these 5 guys had fucked up and had beaten up the wrong person. Not only that, but they had bragged about it and lied to whoever they worked for about it. Not only were they physically broken, but my grandfather ruined their credibility, so that when they got out, no one, criminal or otherwise, wanted to be associated with them. Once this was all done, my grandfather turned his attention to Dave. He had specifically left Dave for last, knowing that he would shit himself knowing that my grandfather knew what he had done. My grandfather, however, was much more subtle in dealing with Dave, as he thought that a simple beating would be too good for him. He waited and asked around, and it turned out that Dave was not only a compulsive gambler, but also had recently turned into a heavy drug addict as well. My grandfather found out who he was buying his drugs from, when he would usually buy and where. He had a buddy of his follow Dave when he went to buy his stuff, follow him to where he was living and let my grandfather know. My grandfather then called in an anonymous tip that there was a huge drug deal going on at the address, and he thought he heard gunshots. He got 2 of his buddies to do the same. The police investigated, searched the house, and caught Dave red-handed with boatloads of drugs in his home, as well as counterfeit bills, and a ton of other illegal stuff. Dave was charged, denied bail, and ended up pleading guilty to all the charges laid against him. My dad could never remember his exact sentence, but it was definitely heavy, at least 15 years. To add to that, Dave owed a lot of money to a lot of people, and let's just say his time in prison was made much worse by this fact. My dad never spoke to him again. His parents disowned him. His girlfriend dumped him. He struggled to get a job with his record, and when he got out he had to move miles away, as no one he knew wanted anything to do with him. My dad eventually recovered from his injuries, although you can still see various scars on his body from the beating he took. My grandfather never told anyone what he had done until my dad asked him about it, when he got really ill in the early 1990s. Dave's life was ruined, and out of the 5 who attacked my dad, 3 ended up in prison later in life, and 2 ended up dead due to crime. My grandfather passed away in the late 1990s, and although my dad and him had their issues, it could never be said he didn't look out for him when he needed it.
Next story.
This is my first time posting. Sorry for the formatting. My parents divorced when I was in 1st grade. Not only did my dad disappear like Houdini, he stole my mother's AM card to her personal account and drained her dry. My mother, being the saint she is, didn't even bat an eye. She still was cordial to him and never said a negative word about him. To me, my dad, albeit abandoning us, was still my hero. From 1st through 5th grade, I had the usual abandoned by dad stories. Maybe 1 or 2 visits in a year, and 50 times of me waiting by the front window with my suitcase packed to go to his house, and him never showing up. My mom, through all of this, was supportive and never said an ill word about him. So he still stayed my hero. When I was in 6th grade, my mother finally remarried, and my father, who only had a picture of me at 8 months old in his wallet, went ballistic. Did I mention he never paid child support? He would use his father's social. They had the same name, to get away with it. After my mom remarried, he let it be known that I was now my stepdad's responsibility. He cut off communication with me until I graduated high school. He didn't attend my graduation or send a card. What he did do was write me an email thanking God he no longer had to pay child support. He didn't anyway. What really broke me was his ruthless and brutal attack on my mother. Attacking her weight, looks, teeth, and blaming any perceived negative traits that I had on her. For the first time, I realized what a cowardly piece of shit he was. I responded in kind. He told me I was no child of his, and that I was a waste. After that, I vowed that I would hurt him. 10 years later, my father, not interested in my wedding or my son, reached out to me. You see, he is a diabetic, and one of his organs were failing, and he didn't have long. He's too far down on the list, and he needed someone in our family to donate. Nuclear revenge activated. I answered his email. I met up with him and pretended that I didn't hate his guts. I went and got tested to see if I was a match. I was. Did the therapy and met with doctors and his therapist. We scheduled the surgery. The day of the surgery, we meet at the hospital. I smiled in his face and let him know that I wouldn't be going through with the surgery. I watched the confusion line his face. I just wanted you to know that you're no father to me, and you're a waste. I left the hospital and drive home. My mom was pretty annoyed with me that I took it that far. My father is dying, and I will be attending the funeral out of spite. And I will let everyone know what a piece of shit he was. TLDR, father abandoned me and called me a waste. Later in life, he needs an organ. I agree and match with him and abandon him at the hospital the day of the surgery after calling him a waste. He will die, and I will ruin his funeral. Edit 1. This really blew up. For those questioning my actions, I will give further detail. My father is semi-obsessed with my mother. His attachment to us was only in his perceived ability to get back with my mother. In the beginning, he would call and make plans to see us, and just not show up. My mom would have to make up excuses. He has been married over 4 times and supports and loves his stepkids without a thought to us. Once my mother remarried, he was done with us. He kept in contact with my mother through email, but had no interest in talking to his children. I have reached out to him before, to invite him to my graduation, to let him know of my marriage, and that he was a grandfather. All I got back was pictures of his new wife's kiddos. Upon getting to know him after agreeing to donate, I went to one of his therapy sessions at his request. There I heard the story of the true reason he contacted me. I listened as he lamented about his impending death, how he was resigned to his fate, only to have his new wife remind him of his former kids, and maybe one of them will donate. And he got excited because he had forgotten all about us, and it was like hope renewed. Do you know how shitty it is to listen to the person who is responsible for your very existence talk about forgetting your very existence? Like I was a pair or sturdy old boots that gathered dust in the back of the hall closet. Now rediscovered, I was to be warned to go shovel shit. I knew then I wasn't going to give him anything. Thanks for the silver and gold. Edit 2. I'm not worried about a will or being left anything. He had nothing to leave. He's the male equivalent of a gold digger. He only marries women who can take care and support him as he mooches off of them. He stole thousands from my mother, and she didn't press charges because she didn't want her children's father in jail. My mother was his first wife, and he learned his lesson not to have kids of his own, but to move into ready-made families. His ex-wives and their children have nothing nice to say about him. When I told him I wasn't going through with it, he understood exactly why. He nodded his head in understanding. I already was approached for money to contribute to the funeral, and I will.